while we're waiting for Mendy, I mean, maybe we can do our introductions of ourselves and kind of share who we are and what we do. I'll start for the sake of diving in. Hey everybody, I'm David Corus. I'm the president of Stamford Downtown. We're a business improvement district. We represent about 500 property owners, commercial and residential. We do special events, which have been very much constrained over the last year, obviously. Put a lot of education and advocacy around land use issues. I've been in that position for almost a year, and prior to that, I was Deputy Commissioner of Economic and Community Development for the state of Connecticut. I was Director of Resilience for the state, and I was Planning and Economic Development Director in the city of Bridgeport after having spent about 7 years at Regional Plan Association, which is an advocacy organization and education organization based in New York City. Yeah, dive on in, Stacy. Go for it.
Sure, I can go for it. So hi, my name is Stacy Pete. I work at Norwalk Hospital. I run what's called the Norwalk Community Care Team, which is a group of about 25 different organizations in the Norwalk community. It's representative by mental health organizations, the homeless organizations, legal, the police department, probation. We also have our outpatient kind of community health centers, the hospital, and really every Tuesday morning for probably about 6 years now, we get together and we talk about some of the most vulnerable folks that we have. They have to sign a consent, but there's folks that are coming into our emergency room often, or that people in the community are struggling with, and we really coordinate services, and so that we can kind of make sure that we're capturing them and connecting them to housing or treatment or health providers, or usually all of the above. I'm going to go for it, Barbara.
Sure. Good morning, everybody. My name is Barbara Lopez. I'm the director of Make the Road Connecticut. We're a social justice organization that fights for immigrant, Latinx, and Black people to live with dignity and respect in Bridgeport and Hartford. So we have really do this through community organizing. That at the grassroots level, we can really make an impact. We also heavily invest in our leaders through leadership development. We do legal and survival services, and we also think about policy in innovative ways. And really excited to share some of the stories on the ground, and excited to be on this panel.
Yeah, I'll finish us off with here. Emily Byrne with Connecticut Voices for Children. We are a statewide research-based advocacy organization, also known as a Think and Do Tank, located in New Haven, Connecticut, that's situated on Quinnipiac and Pawcasset land. Our strategic aim is toward economic justice, and for us at Connecticut Voices, economic justice is an umbrella term for a variety of anti-racist policies that together counteract the negative impacts of historically racist policies in the country that prevent equal opportunity to income and wealth creation. That said, we know that true justice in any respect is impossible to achieve without a comprehensive package of policies that address all the different aspects of our lives. But our mission is to improve the well-being of children and families that have historically been disadvantaged in Connecticut. And so we focus on family economic security and the undergirding fiscal and economics. And I'm very excited and happy to be here.
Thank you all. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mindy Blue-Packa, and I am moderating this panel. I thank everyone for your patience. I was having a few glitches this morning, but I thank the panelists for jumping in and doing their introductions. I am the Chief Community Impact Officer at Fairfield County's Community Foundation, and we are the community foundation that serves the 23 towns and cities in Fairfield County, Connecticut, and we will talk a lot about Fairfield County today. So before we jump into our panel, and we've covered introductions, so once we get going, we won't have to go back there. I'd like to take a few minutes and just orient everyone to a bit about the housing landscape in the state of Connecticut. So we are now going to share a brief PowerPoint that hopefully you can see very well on your screens right now. So this morning, our goal is to shed light, as I mentioned, on the issues of housing inequity in the state of Connecticut. And Connecticut's an important part of the New York City metro region that could, in fact, be providing more opportunity to low-income people, and especially low-income people of color. So this morning, with these dynamic panelists who you've already had the good fortune of meeting, we'll discuss interdisciplinary cross-sector approaches. As you've heard, they're each from representing different sectors regarding pursuing housing equity. And the reason that we're really focused on doing this is because we very much believe that having broad-based buy-in and support is essential to making progress in a housing landscape as unique as Connecticut's, which you'll hear more about in a minute. So specifically today, we're going to be looking at the intersections of housing, education, economic development, and health. And we'll discuss how community organizing has been a key driver in addressing housing issues for some of the state's vulnerable residents. Once we've completed this brief introduction, we'll jump into our panel, and there will be opportunity for question and answer with the panelists at the end of our discussion. So once we get to that portion of the program, feel free to submit your questions through the chat function at any point during the presentation. Next slide, please. So the panel today is brought to you by Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity and the Regional Plan Association. So a bit about these two organizations. The Regional Plan Association is a nonprofit research, planning, and advocacy organization that is dedicated to improving the New York metropolitan region's economic health, environmental sustainability, and quality of life. And the Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity is an innovative strategic partnership that's committed to elevating housing as the foundation for opportunity throughout Fairfield County. So my organization, Fairfield County's Community Foundation, is a founding partner of the center, along with the Regional Plan Association support of Housing Works and Partnership for Strong Communities. Next slide. So now for a brief overview of Connecticut's housing landscape. Connecticut housing, that is defined by racial segregation, high racial segregation. People of color reside primarily in the state's urban centers, and in contrast, the state's suburban communities are majority white. The map on the left here shows primarily Fairfield County, with non-white populations appearing mostly in the cities of Bridgeport, Norwalk, and Stamford. And as you might suspect, racial segregation corresponds with housing opportunity or lack thereof. Next slide, please. Housing in Connecticut is extremely expensive. That's another key marker of the landscape we're facing. Connecticut's minimum wage is $11 per hour. And according to a 2020 study from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, at minimum wage, an individual would have to work 96 hours a week in order to afford a modest two-bedroom home. Working a more standard 40-hour work week, one would have to earn $26.42 an hour, which is more than 2 times minimum wage, in order to afford the same two-bedroom home. So the high cost of market rate housing corresponds with an extreme shortage of affordable housing in the state. Next slide, please. And coupled with the high price of housing, there's a severe shortage of available affordable housing for those who need it, including households that are classified as extremely low income. 63% of extremely low income households spend more than half of their income on rent. So I'll actually just pause there for a quick second just to process that and let that sink in for a second, the realities of spending more than half of your income just to keep a roof over your head. 1/3 of Connecticut households are classified as extremely low income, and the majority of them spend more than half of their income on rent. According to the National Housing Preservation Database, there's a shortage of nearly 87,000 homes to meet the housing needs of extremely low-income renters. There's a great need for housing in Connecticut, as you can see, and increasing affordable housing stock would benefit the entire community and the economy. Next slide, please. So in light of this, it's important to make the case that building affordable homes is a boon for the economy in Connecticut. And I'm sure David will share much more insight on this soon. But this is a more positive story to tell related to housing. Specifically, the construction of affordable housing can be a major source of growth in economic activity, jobs, and state and local tax bases. Moreover, on average, every household occupying a new affordable housing unit contributes $7,000 in incremental disposable income to the local economy. So as we get people housed, the dollars circulate and everyone benefits. Next slide, please. Thank you. Racial segregation in Connecticut also extends to school attendance by impacting the boundaries that are drawn to determine which public schools children attend based on their residence. So the image on the left shows how schools in Greenwich, Connecticut are zoned now. And in the darker shades of purple, you'll see that students of color are concentrated in 4 areas, with more being in the bottom left-hand corner of the map there. And the image on the right shows what school demographics would look like if students were zoned to the schools that are nearest to them. So while the overall picture would still be pretty segregated, Black and brown students would be dispersed a little bit more over 5 areas rather than 4. And so we see that while Greenwich is already very residentially segregated, the way schools are zoned actually further increases segregation. Next slide, please. Community organizing has been an essential part of the fight for housing equity during the pandemics in particular. Organizers such as Make the Road Connecticut have fought to secure support for marginalized populations who are traditionally unsupported by government and unable to afford their rent, particularly during these really difficult times. So while the support secured does not meet all of the current outstanding need, the Connecticut Department of Housing has provided $2.5 million to landlords whose undocumented tenants have fallen behind on rent, and a charity, 4ct.org, provided $1 million to be distributed to undocumented families screened for need by community groups like Make the Road. So we will hear more about how community organizers are making a difference and having impact on this issue, but that's just a little bit of an overview. Next slide, please. Similar to the work of organizers that's been highlighted by the pandemic has highlighted how our inequitable housing landscape endangers people's health and lives. The recent eviction moratorium issued by the CDC has reinforced the deep connections between housing and public health. In Connecticut, healthcare systems and hospitals play an important part in shaping community and community investment. New Vance Health, which Stacy is joining us from, one of Connecticut's largest health systems, is on the cutting edge of innovative approaches to holistically meet the needs, holistic needs, in fact, of both health and housing for some of the state's most vulnerable residents. Next slide. And finally, as we wrap up the overview, it's important to note that all of our work to increase the quantity and quality of Connecticut's housing is taking place against a dynamic and often challenging social and political backdrop. Home rule, NIMBYism, years of intentional institutional racism, and other powerful social and political forces influence the pace and style of the work that's being undertaken. And many Connecticut towns and residents buy into false narratives about affordable housing, opposing changes to the character of their neighborhood, or fearing often unfounded thoughts about decreases in property value. So the collective work of community organizations, which you'll hear about today, advocates, organizers, is helping to reframe the narrative of affordable housing and placing access to housing opportunity at the center of conversations about what it means to have vibrant and thriving communities. So with that, you have already met our panelists, so we will jump right in with the first question. we've heard from each of you, and you're all working in different intersecting sectors. And so I'd love for each of you to take a minute and walk us through where you see the effects of housing inequity actually showing up in your work. Maybe we'll start with Emily.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Mendy. And also thanks to the Regional Plan Association as well as Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity for lifting up this very important topic. You just heard all the reasons from Mendy in terms of why Black and Brown children and families in the state of Connecticut are living and navigating systems that are designed to set them up for failure, and yet they still succeed. And I think when it comes to education and housing intersections, the short answer is that housing inequity deeply impacts education in a myriad of ways, from zoning and land use design that segregates populations, which ultimately increase segregation in schools, to funding choices that limit affordable housing and perpetuate a disinvestment in urban communities, which ultimately impacts student academic achievement. The long answer is that the challenges students face don't stand alone, right? They interact with one another. That's the point of the panel. A student could be absent from class due to a combination of housing insecurity, food insecurity, mental health challenges, and more. And quite frankly, the highest quality of instruction can rarely overcome these challenges. I think as human beings, we have an array of needs that need to be met. Maslow's hierarchy, right? So if you picture the pyramid, at the bottom of the pyramid are physiological needs like food, sleep, safety, security, health, and shelter. And these are the fundamental things that are required before learning can even happen. Once the basic needs are met, somewhere in the middle of the pyramid, humans can build close, caring relationships, and in the context of those relationships, begin to seek learning and work that kind of garner accomplishment and status. At the very top of the pyramid is the highest level of need, and that really is one of expanding the mind. Right, critical thinking, engaging, and self-reflection and creativity all exist here, but they don't occur until the other levels of need are met. And so Maslow's pyramid illustrates how children kind of set the table for learning, which hopefully helps us to make sense of the fact that when the basic needs like housing are met, of course, student performance is going to be impacted. Mandy, I think you're muted.
Oh.
Can you all see Mindy anymore?
No. Do you want me to? Should we continue?
Yeah, why don't we?
Pass this in. So I can talk about the intersection between housing inequality and the health system. So there's been a big focus lately in the health system, what we call social determinants of health. And it's definitely been getting more and more traction within the healthcare world. So what they're finding, about 20% of your health outcomes is determined by social determinants of health. And one of the big determinants of health is housing stability. It can also include food, access to food, transportation. And so when we look at the actual interventions that you get at the hospital, is about 10% of your health outcome. 20% is the social determinants of health. And then the other percentages are made up of your genetics and also some of your social behaviors like smoking and drinking. And because of this, and because we know that there's such a direct impact, hospitals and healthcare systems have started to implement more programs, trying to think out of the box about how we can affect systems that aren't happening within our four walls. when you think of a very concrete example, something that comes up oftentimes in the hospital, like let's say you have somebody who's diabetic, but they're homeless. So how are they going to even be able to manage their, their diet, for example? How are they going to be able to keep, if they're insulin dependent, where is their access to a refrigerator to keep their meds? So those are some concrete examples about why it's really important for us to get in the game as far as housing stability. COVID, has really kind of very much highlighted some of the differences for us. You think about people maybe, multiple roommates in one room because they can't afford their own apartment, and one person tests positive for COVID. Then how are they going to socially isolate? So those are some of the things that I would say have beginning to get on the radar more for healthcare.
Thank you, Stacy. I was sharing before I was booted out of our meeting that, Emily, you set a really great foundation in terms of linking the really inextricable elements of housing to really the rest of our fundamental needs. So education and health being chief among them, obviously. Let's transition a little bit to think about how housing impacts some areas that we might not as readily associate. So David, would you share how you've seen that showing up in your work related to economic development?
Sure, absolutely. So, for the last 15 years or so, I've held various economic development positions, and it's really remarkable how much of that time has been dedicated to housing issues, which was not something that I thought I was getting into when I embarked on my career. And at every stage, frankly, I view it less about the individual, as my colleagues here do, and more about the systems related to kind of a functioning housing market, the ability to attract and retain and grow companies, and the efficacy and efficiency of the transportation system. So, first on the functioning housing market, whenever I'm working in a community and talking about housing development, I always ask the participants, which are typically in their, 40s, 50s, 60s or older, if they live in the house that was the first house that they bought. And the answer is, of course, no. They had some sort of a starter house, and now they have a bigger house or a condo or such that they grew into. And I say, so what makes you think then that other members of our community are going to magically be able to parachute in and buy your big single family house from you? No, we need the starter homes. We need the entry homes. We need a diverse range of housing options so that people can enter in our community. People can upgrade to a bigger house when that makes sense for them. And then when people are looking to downsize, because they're empty nesters or whatever, they have places to go into. You need all those components in order for each one to function individually. When it comes to, employment attraction, we have, unfortunately, a lot of anecdotes from companies who were thinking to relocate to Connecticut from other parts of the country and ultimately chose not to do so because their workforce started looking at the housing options in Connecticut and said, yeah, there's a lot of this one product, but I'm looking for something different. And ultimately companies that have, had to make the decision to add those jobs elsewhere because the housing options were better suited to meet the needs of their workforce. And then finally, in transportation, the farther we push people from their place of employment, the more they need to commute longer distance, and the less likely that transit or other transportation alternatives are a viable option. And that just breaks down the efficiency of the system. It forces them to drive longer. It forces them to be dependent on the automobile. And so housing really is one of the key interventions we can make in communities that simultaneously improve our transportation system, improve the efficacy of our housing market, and improve our ability to attract and retain jobs.
Thanks, David. I think we're going to get into in a bit deeper discussion on what it takes to create more collective support for housing equity. But I think this concept that you've raised around workforce housing is a really important one related to that, right? There was a time when when employers were really driving housing policy in many ways throughout the country, and we've really seen shifts from that. So I'd love for you to share with us a little more about that as we get into that part of the discussion. And Barbara, you really work on the ground with individual families. As you know, David just shared, he's thinking really macro. You're really thinking about on the ground, how is this person, this family being impacted, and helping to mobilize individuals to really be a part of the solution for their lives. So can you share with us how you're seeing housing intersect with the plethora of ways in which you're supporting communities in terms of their own agency?
Thanks, Mindy. And I'm definitely seeing a lot of intersections with everything colleagues on the panel said. I want to highlight what Emily said about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Pre-COVID, we're a multi-issue, multi-generational organization. So pre-COVID, we knew housing was an issue, but somehow our families, our undocumented families, or mixed status families, or young people managed to figure out the housing situation, and that really allowed space for us to really tackle education equity, or economic issues. Once the pandemic hit, all these things that were already bubbling up just went on hyperdrive. So since day one, March 16th, we were getting calls from our members from across the spectrum, our undocumented members, our mixed status members, and our young people being terrified of what's going to happen if I can't work, I can't buy my bills, I can't pay rent, I can't, etc. Or if they're a young person, if I support my family by working at Dunkin' Donuts and McDonald's, I can't add support. So we really saw housing at the forefront of our members saying, hey, if I don't have where to live, I can't thrive, or I am going to be homeless and I don't qualify for, if you're undocumented or a mixed status family, they don't qualify for any federal support. So a lot of families got the federal stimulus if they were individual, single, or family households. And our undocumented families or mixed status families or young people that have parents who are undocumented got zero. So you add to, there's a big housing crisis that was, as you mentioned in the intro, happening before this pandemic. And now fast forward to now, there's no economic support. They did create a housing program that are for undocumented families that I can share a little bit down the road. But then I think something that Stacey mentioned, a lot of our families don't have your traditional living situations. We have a lot of families that live one apartment, 2 bedrooms, there's 3 families, right? Or we have a family that rents a studio, or we have friends of friends. We have non-traditional how people live. So all these things have made it very difficult for us to ignore that housing is an issue, and that if people don't have where to live, they can't access education. So learning from home has been a challenge. Our young students, our young people, our parents supporting their students have seen a spike of their students or children being disengaged in education. And on top of that, if you live in situations like Stacey said, where you're all in one spot, people are going to get sick. So if they don't have access to affordable, equitable, or just, basic healthcare, then it's going to spread broader and wider in Black and Brown and immigrant communities, folks getting infected with COVID-19. So it's been a really challenging time to see how housing is really just impacting different facets of people's lives.
Thank you, Barbara. So you've all really laid the foundation for the ways in which, the externalities in terms of how housing shows up across the spectrum are really countless and endless. So we have seen, as we shared in the beginning, despite a complicated political and social climate, we have seen some movement in terms of new housing legislation in the state of Connecticut. And we know that the right action at the state level, coupled with federal support and the right really movement in terms of local activity, particularly around zoning, can really have a significant impact. But the question I have for each of you is, it's not going to probably work if all we have is quote unquote housing advocates pushing this work in a silo. And so how can we motivate your sectors and the leaders and the advocates in your sectors to really invest in this housing equity work and to take action in terms of supporting these initiatives that we see popping up? What would make them commit to being a part of the fight? And I promise not to come to you first for everything, Emily, but do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. I think we often hear, at least within the education circles, it's we often hear educators saying, that all kids should have access to high quality education regardless of their zip code, right? So I do think that education folks theoretically have known housing and education are intersectional issues. That said, affordable housing in Connecticut was in a state of crisis before the pandemic. And I don't think that there was much of an effort on the part of education folks to engage in housing issues, and vice versa. Although I think housing folks have been quicker to the punch. I'm looking at this panel. This would not have been possible. Like, I don't actually remember a time 7 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago, where like this panel, this intersectional type of panel would come together. And so I do feel very, very hopeful. I think that I'm mindful of the time. So I think there's a lot of good movement. I think that, housing advocates, as housing advocates, we need to do a better job of sharing knowledge and bringing more people to the table. I do think there's an incredible amount of synergy between education and housing folks. I think everyone needs to be better listeners. I think that, it's only really been in the past couple of years that education people have really started actively working together with housing folks. And to be clear, like, I'm very excited about this, right? I think it's exciting that housing is finally having its moment. It's unfortunate that it's taken a pandemic and a housing crisis, right, an eviction crisis to get us to this point. But events like this definitely give me hope. I think we just got to keep working together. We got to keep sounding the alarm. And I think if we do these things, we definitely can grow a coalition and affect change.
Emily. And Stacey, for obvious reasons, people are paying a lot of attention to your sector. So how do you see movement happening, and do you see housing being a part of that conversation, and how can it become more so?
Sure, absolutely. So it's been going on for a little while with the Affordable Care Act. I would like to say, obviously New Advance Health, we're a nonprofit hospital, so we see a whole range of different people coming in. And I would like to think, we got in the game because we really cared, but honestly, there's a big money incentive going on in healthcare right now. So healthcare is changing from every time you come to, let's say, the emergency room and we bill your insurance. We're starting to do more and more bundled payments, meaning we get agreements with healthcare plans. So let's say we get an agreement with Aetna. They agree to pay us X amount of money if we service X amount of people, right? So let's say we get, $500,000 to serve 100 people. If we're able to keep our costs down, we get to save that money. If those people cost us more money, we get to pay back the insurance company. So there is a big incentive, and that is honestly why I'm part of a department called Special Population Health, which is new for us as a network. It's I was here when it was built about 6 years ago, and it's an ever-growing program. But the reason why we're built is because we're really looking at ways to keep, honestly, people out of the hospital, which I know sounds really weird in these COVID times. But if you think about it pre-COVID, and there will be a post-COVID, So we really are making more connections in the community. We're making more connections with our community health centers. I sit on a lot of the homeless boards meetings. We have a huge investment in kind of trying to manage even, especially our most vulnerable population, because if we can get them connected to primary care, if we can get them somewhere stable, if we can get a visiting nurse to them, not only is it the right thing to do, but there's a financial incentive for the hospitals right now.
Makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And David, you had started in terms of touching on the really various aspects of your sector, but how do we get employers and developers and such engaged in this conversation and being advocates?
Yeah, I think they are engaged, but oftentimes in the wrong way. And I think part of the challenge is so much of the discussion around affordable housing is reactive and is around individual projects. And time and again we've demonstrated that when we're proactive in sort of thinking broadly about it, when we're participatory in engaging with the broad range of stakeholders, when we're interdisciplinary in how that conversation takes place, we can achieve policy objectives that are kind of in the theoretical, that are not tinged with the emotion around a specific project. And so, frankly, too much of the discussion is taking place at planning and zoning hearings when the project has already been proposed or the idea is already out there, and we're essentially on the defense trying to keep it alive. When my professional experience has demonstrated to me that when we get out in front, when we are able to bring together representatives of the community that deal with education, that deal with health, that deal with development, that deal with environmental protection, et cetera, and engage them in a broader conversation about the future of their community, housing production and deed restricted housing for affordable or workforce is so regularly identified as part of the solution. And so, I've been involved in multiple planning projects where, the charge had nothing to do with housing, but it was after we all got together, understood each other's issues, and then took a step back and thought about the targeted ways in which we could intervene to create solutions that would be cross-sector. Housing, more often than not, was the answer. And so, I think the trick is to create a safe space and a venue wherein those different parties can engage with one another around the outcomes they're looking to achieve, much like we just heard from Stacy and Emily. And then developers, business interests, et cetera, will be happy to be at that table. It's when they're backed into playing defense to defend projects that by the time they're announced already are facing community opposition, that it's really pretty hard for folks to get out front on a limb on that. But if you can be proactive, I think there's a big opportunity there.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Barbara, I'd like to shift gears a little bit with you and ask you a slightly different question, which is that, you have been on the ground throughout the pandemic, really focused on this issue of eviction prevention in terms of housing in Connecticut. So tell us a little bit about how you actually managed to garner that legislative support that we all would need to be seeking on these issues, and some of the successes that you've had in that area recently. Looks like Barbara's frozen. There you go. Maybe we're getting her back.
Wi-Fi?
You were frozen for a second, but it looks like we've got you back.
Oh no, I'm sorry, I missed the question.
Okay, sure. So the question very simply was, what have you been doing for the past few months? Because we know that you've been really focused on eviction prevention, and that you've secured some victories, and you've worked and collaborated with legislators. So how have you done that? And tell us what you've accomplished.
Yeah, so this is a hard question, right? So I reflected on this question. So Make the Road Connecticut, we're in this particular situation where we're in this really place of tension. So we really look at how do we look at systems and how are people of color, like how do they navigate, or how are they in the system, right? And in April and May and June, like we had to hustle to figure out how to like have on the ground support. And in June, we were one of the organizations that launched this $2.5 million fund going to undocumented families, with 1 million from 4CT, with the lens of that was going to be the first phase, right? And then we were going to work hard to expand or to work for something more sustainable and long term. So a bigger fund for undocumented families that was, you know, like just for workers, for bills, for everything. We're a bigger fund. And we're now in November, and you know, we have hopes and dreams, but then the reality hits in, right? So it's been really hard to implement the 2.5 million for undocumented families. For various reasons. People don't have traditional living situations. It's going to the landlord, not the families. It's really difficult to get landlords to submit certain paperwork. And then it's, you know, it's a new program, so it's taking a long time to actually implement. So we haven't seen from Make the Road, Connecticut, it's been really hard to implement a program, while when we call folks, they're not just sharing, you know, I haven't paid 1 month, 2 months, I haven't paid 6 months of rent, and I'm gonna owe, and I'm gonna owe, and I'm feeling the pressure of the landlord, that it's like, because I'm undocumented, they're putting pressure that if I don't pay, they're gonna call ICE on me, or I got really sick, or et cetera, et cetera. So these are really traumatic times, and these are the adults we're talking to. We're not even looking at how it's impacting children and the next generation to come that are really experiencing COVID. So it's been this real tension of, we're a part of this program because our members need it, and we understand that it's not going to solve the 6, 7, or year of rent they're going to owe, but it's going to give them a little bit of relief. And then really challenging of getting Governor Lamont to sit at the table and say, hey, yes, it's great that private philanthropy stepped up, and it's great that you invested 2.5 mil. But there needs to be a real conversation of what more is the state of Connecticut going to do for its residents, regardless of status. How is legislation going to be long term? So it's been really hard to get the Lamont administration at the table to hear from the people on the ground. So I feel like there were, and it's been, you know, our members voicing their stories, voicing how they want more. So it's been this real tension of like, we need to keep advocating, and then the reality is hitting out for a lot of folks that, you know, there's a spike in COVID, and also the end of moratorium is coming. So what is that going to look like? So the reality of like, what's going to look like beyond 2021. So one of the small victories that we did is we did a survey of our 100 of our members to really inform how we're going to do legislation for 2021 and beyond.
So, I mean, in summary, I think you're saying it's complicated, and really thinking about how to integrate the perspectives of all the diverse stakeholders that have to be on board is really particularly complicated. On this call alone, we have someone who focuses on community organizing. We have an organization in Connecticut Voices, which focuses on advocacy and research. We have direct service providers like Stacy's organization. And then we have folks that are focused on systems, right, more broadly. So I think we know part of why this panel is composed the way it is because we know all of those voices are incredibly important. But as you said, Barbara, getting the attention of elected officials and each piece of each component of that system getting that attention, it's hard work, but it's necessary. So kudos to you for working so hard at that throughout the pandemic. So let's keep on in the spirit of wins and successes, and let's think a little bit theoretically about if we get this right, what does it mean for your sector, and what are the positive outcomes you envision being possible if we achieve more housing equity? Anyone can run with that question. Who's got a thought? Stacy, I think you're on mute if you're trying to share.
Sorry, my fault.
Sure. Yeah.
So when I was reflecting of this, I was beginning to think, I spend a lot of my time sometimes trying to put Band-Aids on things that maybe if things were more equitable, that the problems wouldn't even exist. So for instance, sometimes, we ran data at one point about our emergency services, our EMS, and what we're trying to kind of look at hotspots within our town of Norwalk. And then I kind of thought about, if they're making so many calls to this one building, if we put a social service provider there, would that help? If we put services there. But then when I think about if things were just more equitable, maybe people would have equal access to things and we wouldn't have to kind of create solutions that didn't need it, that wouldn't have existed in the first place.
Thanks, Stacy. Thoughts on that question?
I think, from my perspective, much as I've alluded to already, you'll have a more functioning housing market. I mean, right now we're in a very odd situation where we've got this blip of demand coming up from New York City, but it's a bit of an anomaly. It probably represents some pent up demand that that would have played out over time, but it's not really sustainable. And in order to have a better functioning housing market, it needs to be a little bit more internal churn. And I think on the whole, just seeing a transition to more complete communities, right? I mean, we have individual communities are, a handful of communities, as we saw on your maps, Mindy, are bearing the brunt of, trying to meet this demand that's really statewide and in some ways regional in nature. And I think by spreading that out, you'll have not only a dispersion of what's currently being borne out by a handful of cities, but you'll also see the benefits of a more diverse population and a diverse workforce, et cetera, accruing to a broader range of communities. And so just as much as the Bridgeports of the state struggle with an overconcentration of poverty and challenges associating with meeting the needs of that population, so too, at the other end of the spectrum, the Westons and, many other communities of the state, are just starting to see the outcomes from a homogenous population that is white and wealthy and aging. And so I think, the more we start to introduce a diversity of housing options in a broader range of communities, I think those communities will begin to see the ways in which housing choice and affordable housing and workforce housing actually help them meet their objectives for themselves over time as well. And in doing so, by introducing, I've read plenty of articles recently about, those communities where there's opposition to that one development. And, once it opens, the opposition goes away because they realize that their fears were just unfounded. And the more you have those projects implemented, the more it becomes a snowball and sort of an awakening, essentially, that, we were fighting an enemy that didn't really exist. And if we take a step back and actually engage in a more honest conversation about what we want to be when we grow up, unfettered by that unwarranted fear, then we can actually, make new policy choices that put us on a better path.
Sure. Thank you. And some of what you said, I think, is an excellent segue to where I'd like to go next. Let's talk about race and how that is really showing up. So we saw in the overview that housing segregation has frankly historically been intentionally associated with driving racial segregation. That was by design. And we've seen it be quite effective in terms of when we look at access to opportunity and how that breaks down based on race. So a couple themes have come up or thoughts have come up related to this question. And so one is with, the increased attention that issues of racial inequity have gotten recently, particularly, thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement and various other questions related to racial equity, that there's some who might support some of those movements or some of the goals of some of those movements, but simultaneously really don't really are not understanding the importance of advancing housing equity as connected to that. So, one question is there a way to make that connection? We also had a related question come in from the audience, which pointed to something that you were alluding to, David, which is that when we think about how zoning happens at the local level, and we have planning meetings, and in communities like our suburban communities, which are majority white, you have public comment, and they're often in many cases wealthy, but in most cases, white commenters who might have an opinion or an assessment that might take up a lot of the airspace, right? And so how do we balance that with the needs of other members of our community, and in particular, members of people of color in our communities? So not that you have to go in any particular direction, but let's just explore this concept of how race is showing up in your work and what that means. Emily or Barbara, would either of you like to take a stab at that?
Sure. Oh, go ahead, Emily. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Barbara.
Okay. So this question is very hard because even for myself, I'm the director of my organization. Even when I go into these spaces where we're talking about affordable housing, it's very, very a lot of men, and it's very white, right? And sometimes the tone in these conversations is about, let's make it more affordable, and let's figure out how we, whatever town or community you're going into, how we pitch the narrative so people get excited about it, right? And I think that a lot of the times it's really uncomfortable because it's well, you're just tiptoeing around the fact that you're opening affordable housing in places that are very dominated by white or affluent neighborhoods, and you're trying to convince them of this narrative that if people of color come, it won't devalue your community or town. So that is really uncomfortable. But then also, sometimes these towns are not really accessible for people of color. People of color want to live where transportation's accessible, where other people of color live, where they feel part of a community. So I think that just very simply, I think the first piece of, if we really want to make change in the future, is talking about affordable housing, equitable housing, with a racial equity lens, and actually having more voices of color in the room, and people from the community, right? Because I think that if people from the community don't feel welcomed or are not part of these conversations, decisions are made for them without them. And I think that even simply when they're trying to go to meetings in Bridgeport City Council or Hartford City Council, there's no space for them, right? Or there's no language access or translation, or concepts are very big. When people know what they need. They know that they want a safe, clean place to live, and or not to keep adding more rent that they can't afford, pay more rent that they can't afford. So I think that's something that I'm grappling with and reflecting on, and going back to the members and seeing how do we take up or take back the space that should be ours. So yeah, it's really hard to answer what the future looks like when there's a lot of factors that play into it.
Right.
Yeah, at the risk of saying things that people might already know, I do think having shared history is really important. This question is really important. I think we tend to think of the North and Connecticut as being really distant from slavery and its legacy, but Connecticut was actually the last New England state to abolish slavery, and at points actually had the largest population of enslaved people in New England. And this is really important to understand because enslaved people would have been counted towards a person's wealth as part of their personal estate. Right? The highest concentration of enslaved people were in Fairfield County, which, as we know, contains some of the wealthiest towns with some of the most expensive properties in both Connecticut and the United States. Connecticut's residential segregation can be dated back to the 1920s with the Zoning Enabling Act. And I say that to say that, it wasn't until very, very recently, 2015, when, a very obvious, very overt display of discrimination was finally torn down vis-a-vis housing, and that was in the city of New Haven Hamden Town fence. Right, there was this was a long-standing debate that finally got rectified, but it wasn't until 2015. Just for quick reference, the town of Hamden back in the 1950s had erected a fence on the border of New Haven and Hamden to keep the mostly poor, mostly Black and brown residents at a public housing authority separated from the mostly white, mostly wealthy residents of Hamden. And it was because of affirmatively furthering fair housing. It was because of President Barack Obama that HUD intervened. And, irrespective of the fact that the fence was actually on New Haven property, and so the city tore the fence down, it was because of all these things that, 60 years it took for advocates to move from protest to action, right? 60 years and a federal policy. And so I think, we can always, in the vein of education, we can always be better teachers. We can always do more to lift up, the shared history and recognize that we are not that far away.
Yeah. Thank you, Emily. I think that's a really good note to tie everything together on, in terms of just, we know that race is a critical issue that we've got to think about, and we've got to talk about directly if we're thinking about addressing housing equity. But more importantly, we also know that it's not just about what's happening right now, but it's about how we got here. And so we have to understand both how we got here, the current situation we're in, and then we've got to have a vision for where we're trying to go. And so I thank each of you, because I think you each shared in your own ways, helped us understand how we got to where we are in your sectors, what the current situation is, and you provided some thoughts on where we can go if folks really do understand how important it is to really center housing opportunity in all of this work. And so hopefully the audience has appreciated dialoguing with you for the past hour as much as I have. And on that note, I think we will conclude our session, but I would like to just turn it over last to our panelists, so you don't necessarily have to hear from me last, to see if there's any final words either any of you would like to share on this topic with the audience.
Just thanks everybody for participating.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it was a great conversation, and nice to see so many folks from so many different places listening in.
Great. And hopefully everyone now understands a little bit about what I think is special, but the very unique circumstances under which we are actually doing this work in our very unique state. So we're small but special. So thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.